a further investigative look into the Karambit features of the Sayoc Winkler RnD compact Tomahawk. One thing that we want to take into consideration when we're looking at the Karambit features of this Tomahawk is that one, it is within close quarters. So as a result of it, we have to take a look at close quarters strategies and biomechanical advantages when we are within that range. There are several things that we can assume. We can assume is that our adversary will attempt to block. And a lot of times this blocking is going to be with the use of a weapon. But in this video, what we're going to be covering is the use of the hands. Now, whether that is one hand or sometimes in two hands. And usually in the kind of scenarios that our Navy SEALs tend to run into, especially with the use of firearms, then transitioning into close quarters weapons use, we cannot necessarily assume that the adversary is also going to switch to some form of close quarters tool as well. We can't necessarily assume it. What we can assume is that once it is close quarters, the use of the hands or use of the arms for a frame is something that we can safely assume with a relatively high percentage. So one of the things that we can also assume when a barrier is put in place, especially when it's some form of framing, is that when the tomahawk is thrown, or whether it's a tomahawk, a stick, a knife, when it is blocked, we can assume that our own limb is going to be stopped. When I'm throwing an angle number 1 or an angle number 2, it's going to be stopped. This aspect of close quarters combat relating to the use of the weapon where we have to start to take a look at some of those strategies that work really well. And I'm going to be naming some of those sources that I have found to have been most effective in my own personal experience. One of them is the much maligned abanico technique. The abanico technique is from Filipino martial arts, and the most prevalent practitioners of the abanico happens to be the 12 pares practitioners, and it is often used and implemented in a fanning fashion in their WECAF competitions. WECAF is WEKAF, World Eskrima, Kali, and Arnis Federation, and this is where Filipino martial arts practitioners wear full gear, and when they wear full gear, they can go full contact for roughly about 90 seconds to 2 minutes in their sparring rounds. And a very prevalent technique in that style and in those tournaments happens to be the abanico, where there's a use of the stick and a twirling in the wrist so that the striking can be along the head, along the horizontal line, or the vertical lines, so that this kind of use, which is very wrist-centric and very arm-centric, is what is often used in those types of tournaments. What I've found in those types of tournaments is that when an arm presents itself as an obstruction to an angular strike, the WECAF competitor tends to follow through with that momentum. We can expect with this application of the abanico is that it is a continuation of the momentum of the initial strike. So when I fire this angle number 1, I'm not going to go into abanico until I feel that obstruction, and I follow through with my momentum like so. So this is an angle 1 coming to this side, but when it runs into that obstruction, it goes to the other side. It's a pretty nifty trick, but from that abanico, we have several options. One of them, which can be used with the tomahawk, is borrowed from the barong sword methodology, where we take our torso, line it up with a weapon, and then cut through. This is called fulcrum striking from the barong sword methodologies, where when that close quarter comes in and that abanico goes through, we drive this left shoulder into the barong sword and continue to cut through. However, what we will be covering in this episode is going to be handing off that tomahawk after that abanico strike, and instead of using the shoulder as a fulcrum, we're going to hand it off to the left hand, indexing the palm correctly onto the tomahawk, because then from here we can switch to the Karambit strategy in the use of the Sayoc Winkler RnD Tomahawk. A lot of the things that I have just mentioned technically are high concept. To be going from abanico, fulcrum, handoff to Karambit strategies with the tomahawk, that's pretty high concept, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of training. But if it's done correctly, and then you can switch off really effectively you can take full advantage of this specific design. It is so sophisticated that it allows for this kind of strategy to be in place because you can expect it in the kind of combative context that the Navy SEAL Team 6 happen to find themselves in, meaning transitioning from firearms to close quarters to weapons-based interventions. One of the sophisticated feature designs of the Sayoc Winkler Tomahawk that I have pointed out endlessly in all of my videos is the fact that this reverse spike here was designed so that any sort of indexing along the hand actually does not harm the hand with any sort of radial ulnar deviation. Now, whether that is pointing up or pointing down, we can expect that this reverse spike is not going to bite into the hand of the user. And that's one thing that I really appreciate, in that they understand this detail of the Tomahawk. But it's not just the reverse spike. Notice that the reverse spike is angled relative to the curvature of the handle, so that this exact shape here allows for the hand to slip right in, to do some fine work if I'm holding it this way, or to hand it off, slide down, so that now I can do gross motor work with the Tomahawk as if it were a Karambit, meaning I am using Karambit biomechanics and techniques so that I can now use the bottom end of the Tomahawk as if it was a Karambit, but using the handle as a form of lever to control the opponent. So I really hope you enjoyed this video, and as per usual in our videos, no boyfriends were harmed in the making of this video. Thank you for letting me share, and I hope you enjoy this video. Whenever we are thinking to close the gap to initiate close quarters combat, we have to think from a Filipino martial arts standpoint that the strike is going to be blocked. So in this instance, when Robin blocks with two hands, the initial momentum that is driven from the first strike, in this case an angle number 1, has to continue using an abanico or fan movement onto the other side. So this is a continuous strike. This now allows me to create angles onto the other side of her body without allowing her defenses to stop the momentum of that strike. One of the ways we drive that momentum is through fulcrum striking, and fulcrum striking is when the entire body gets behind the strike and pushes through using the momentum of the twisting of the torso. So I can do that by twisting through one shoulder versus the other, but in this video we're going to focus on hand switching, and we're also going to be using hand switching to set up the Karambit tactics. You can take a look at some of my earlier videos to take a look at those initial strategies that are in the Estocada system, but here we're going to focus on Karambit strikes. Fluid shoulder interplay is important to observe here, because in this one the left shoulder goes up to the Tomahawk, but in some instances the right shoulder actually feeds the Tomahawk to the other side. So it's important to take a very close look and exercise a high level of kinesthetic awareness to see what works best, because a lot of what's going to give you the ability to decide that is what your opponent or your training partner feeds you. Now let's take a look at some of the close quarter capabilities of the Tomahawk relating to these handoffs. So now we can go ahead and set up the Karambit grip. Once we have that, we can start to utilize the right hand for some grappling capabilities, and that's where those two work in tandem, so that the left hand can work as a Karambit while the other one works as a grappling control. Limb control here, and then use the handle as a type of lever to control the entire torso. I have several positional preferences wherein I like to hand off the Tomahawk onto my left hand so that the Tomahawk is set up optimally for that Karambit position and I can execute the Karambit paradigm. A lot of them are from other key martial arts. For instance, one of them is the Plumada Revés position from the Navaja system. The other one is a modified hanging guard, so I can hand it off to the left. The other one is relatively simple, and it's from the Dog Brothers FMA system, where we use the Payong position to enter and then hand off to the left and use the Karambit. That one I like a lot for sparring scenarios, and I think that that's the one that most people are going to end up using. Close quarters combat can become conceptually complex because there are several strategies in play, and also the biomechanics of the practitioner has to remain relatively fluid. So the way we like to train it, especially especially between me and Robin, is to train it from long range first. That way the gross motor movements are drilled in first, and then we get closer and closer so that she can start to understand and implement the biomechanics necessary, but also the strategies that needs to be set in place so that she can become successful. So notice that in these long range drills, she can use those gross motor capabilities and also start drilling them in. But the time will come as she becomes more familiar with them and the energy and speed picks up, she will start to train in closer quarters. And once again, the energy has to be relatively tempered. That way she can start to recalibrate those gross motor movements that she acquired in long range. But the idea is to use the Numerata system from Filipino martial arts so she can start to feel a reactive flow whenever she feels resistance, using momentum, abanico, fulcrum, and karambit handoffs so she becomes really successful. In the application of abanico and fulcrum principles that are borrowed from the barong sword and implementing the karambit paradigm onto the sophisticated design of the Winkler RnD Sayoc Tomahawk. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.